President-elect Joe Biden has yet to nominate someone for the role of Interior Secretary, but one name has many Democrats excited about the potential pick. Democratic New Mexico Congresswoman Debra Haaland has caught the eye of several House Democrats who are pushing Mr. Biden to make the historic nomination. If selected and approved, she would be the first Native American cabinet secretary in U.S. history. Congresswoman Haaland already serves as the vice chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. So let us bring in Julian Brave NoiseCat for more on this. He is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Data for Progress. Thank you so much for joining us, Julian. You know, whenever we talk about some of these names that are being floated, we sort of look at their resume to see what they've done, what they've accomplished. But I think, you know, if her name does end up coming forward, it's much more than her resume that we should be looking at. But let's talk about it. Why is Debra Haaland being looked at for this position, and what would this pick mean for the future of Native Americans in Congress?
Well, first, Chokwinok, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. You know, we have never had a Native American cabinet secretary. We've never had a Native American at the helm of the Department of the Interior, which is, just so our viewers know, the agency that's in charge with managing this nation's public lands, natural resources, as well as its relationship with the 574 federally recognized American Indian and Alaska Native tribal communities across this country. So I think it's hard to overstate how significant Representative Haaland's potential appointment could be. And, you know, I think that you can see the excitement around this potentially historic nomination in the way that not just Indian country, but also environmentalists, progressives, even some congressional Republicans have started to rally behind her potential selection.
You know, when I heard President-elect Biden's speech shortly after the election, it was clear that he was going to win this election. He thanked a number of minority groups, including Native Americans. And it stood out to me because I thought to myself, I don't know if I've ever heard that before in a speech. Maybe it's happened, but it really stood out to me. And now we see this potential appointment. All that being said, you know, the conversation that many minority groups are having in this country is, you know, words are not enough. And simply appointing someone to a position, representation counts, but you need to go a step further. So I'm curious, how have Indigenous communities traditionally approached politics? And does this potential cabinet pick have the ability to change that approach?
It's such a complicated question, right, for Indigenous peoples. Of course, this country was all Indian land at one point in time, and we have, of course, lost much of our land, much of our culture, our languages are endangered. And, you know, I think that our relationship with the federal government has reflected that very troubling history, a history that has at places and times become a genocide, truthfully. That is what historians are describing it as. And, you know, because of that very hard history, a history wherein I think many tribal leaders and politicians are very aware of the risks of our political system, our two-party system turning against Indian country, I think we've developed a very shrewd and diplomatic relationship with both parties. You know, Native people can go to both Democrats and Republicans to take on the issues that matter to us, things like tribal sovereignty, things like our right to our lands, things like funding for, you know, education in schools where our culture can be protected and maintained, all of those things. And, you know, I think that you can also see that history in Representative Haaland's own legislative track record. You know, she is a progressive. She's a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. But she has had a very unique and uniquely successful and savvy ability to reach across the aisle. So, you know, Congressman Tom Cole, a Republican from Oklahoma, spoke very glowingly of her, as did Representative Don Young, a Republican from Alaska. And it is those relationships across the aisle that have actually helped her pass already three bills into laws in just 2 years in Congress, which is, you know, in our era of partisan gridlock, pretty much unheard of.
So to that point, you asked Haaland if she fears that her nomination could potentially lock Native Americans in as, part of the Democratic Party, primarily Democratic supporters. What was her answer? And is there a concern that her nomination could maybe isolate the GOP, despite her own record of, as you point out, working across the aisle?
Yeah, so I asked the Congresswoman and a number of political insiders from Indian country, folks who worked in the Obama administration, others, whether there was any risk that, doing something historic like appointing the first Native American to a cabinet secretary position, to the Secretary of Interior, could solidify Indian country as a Democratic bloc, a Democratic voting bloc. And the Congresswoman, said that she's not worried about that, as did everyone else I asked. She said specifically that we need to be able to work with whoever is in that position. They need to know that we care about them. And she pointed out, which I think was a very good point, that no matter who gets this role, given the energy behind her name and the energy that's been going into appointing the first Native American cabinet secretary, it's going to be very hard for the next Secretary of Interior to not pay attention to Indian country. Though it's very clear that Native people care about this nomination and who is in President Biden's cabinet. At the same time, I think it's important to add that Indian country on net tends to vote for Democrats. Exit polls from 2020 suggest that Native people voted for President-elect Biden by about 25 points. In some places, the margins are pretty large, like the Navajo Nation, who can probably credibly claim that they played a significant role in Democrats' win in Arizona, both for the presidential election and for that Senate seat. And so, I would say that it's a balancing act, the ability to work across the aisle. Of course, there are very few people and politicians in this country that are still able to do it. I think that we all try once in a while around Thanksgiving, to do that sort of cross the table conversation. And I think that that's something that Native people, just because, again, of that very real sense of the risks of getting this system turned against us, have been very shrewd in our ability to work with representatives of both parties, even while I think we clearly lean towards the Democratic Party.
Julian, before I let you go, I have to talk to you about the pandemic and Native Americans. Like many minority communities in this country, Native Americans have been hit particularly hard. Leaders have done what they can to manage the virus, but really the federal government could make a huge difference. What do you want to see from a Biden administration? How can he help the Native American community in this country moving forward when it comes to tackling this pandemic?
Indian country has been hit incredibly hard by this pandemic. In the first wave of the coronavirus, the Navajo Nation, which has a population density just slightly higher than Siberia, actually had more coronavirus cases per capita than the Hubei province in China, which is, of course, where the pandemic originated. And right now, as this sort of second wave of the coronavirus is cresting across the country, Indian reservations, particularly in places like North and South Dakota, but also elsewhere, are some of the hardest hit places in the United States and in the world. And of course, Congress is right now sitting on their hands. There's no congressional action happening. And when it comes to reservations where, reservations are actually not part of the states where they're in, they're actually federal lands, that congressional support, that nation-to-nation relationship between tribes and the federal government is essential. It is what, keeps the schools open, is what funds the Indian Health Services, which provides health care. It even, cares for the roads and things like that. So, I think that I'm confident that, given that, Joe Biden worked in President Obama's administration, Obama really understood these issues. I'm confident that President-elect Biden will, prioritize and really care for and pay attention to tribes in sort of the next round of coronavirus relief. I think that it's going to be a real fight, truthfully, to get that relief through Congress. But again, I think that those relationships that tribes have cultivated across the aisle for decades may turn out to be pretty essential here. If you need to get legislation through a Congress where, the Republicans look likely to retain the Senate and Democrats are going to retain the House and obviously just won the White House, having the ability to work with Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and his caucus may turn out to be something that could really help save tribes in this very dark moment.
Right, great point. Julian Brave NoiseCat, I would love to have you on to talk more about COVID and our Native communities, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you can learn more about how COVID is impacting the indigenous community by streaming our CBS News originals, Coronavirus in Navajo Nation. The full story is available anytime at cbsnews.com/Navajo.